Hey, my name is Sam Carter. I'm 38 years old, and I own
You
a
can
little
leave if you
diner out on the
want.
old highway in Cooper's Mill, Tennessee, the kind of place with a counter and 8 booths and a pie case that's seen better days. I've been feeding this town breakfast for going on 15 years. I know how everybody takes their coffee. I know which truckers are running late and which widowers come in just so they don't have to eat alone. What I'm trying to tell you is that I spend my whole life noticing other people's loneliness, and I'd gotten so good at it that I'd stopped noticing my own. The night this story starts is the night a stranger sat down in my own diner and showed me a kindness I'd been trying to repay for 3 years without even knowing it. It was a blind date, my first one since my wife died. My sister Bonnie set it up, and I'd fought her on it for a year, but she wore me down the way little sisters do, and so one Tuesday evening after closing, I left the lights on in the diner and waited, feeling like a fool in a clean shirt for a woman I'd never met. And when she finally came in out of the cold and sat down across from me in the booth, before I could even say hello, before I could pour the coffee, she looked down at her own hands folded on the table and she said, very quietly, in a voice that had clearly said it before, "You can leave if you want. I know I'm probably not what you were hoping for. People usually take one look and find a reason to go." Before I tell you what I said back, the thing that made her cry, do me a favor. If you've ever been quietly kind to somebody and never gotten so much as a thank you for it, if you've ever done a good thing in the dark and let it stay in the dark, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is for you, and I promise you it goes somewhere worth staying for. Let me back up, because you have to understand what kind of shape I was in 3 years ago for any of this to mean what it means. My wife was named Ruth. We ran the diner together for 11 years, and she was the better half of it by a mile, the one who remembered birthdays and slipped extra bacon to the kids and could talk a man out of a black mood with a slice of pie and 10 minutes of her time. Ruth got sick in the spring and was gone by the fall, and I will not spend your time describing what that did to me, except to say that for a while there, I stopped being a person. I kept the diner open because I didn't know how to do anything else, but I was a ghost in my own life, burning the eggs, forgetting the orders, snapping at the regulars who'd known me 20 years. And the diner started to die right along with me. Grief is expensive. I'd let the books go to pieces while Ruth was sick, missed payments I didn't even remember owing, and that fall, the fall after I buried her, it all came due at once. There was a balloon payment on the loan I'd taken to fix the roof. There were back taxes. There was a notice from the bank, the kind with the heavy language, telling me I had 30 days to come up with a little over $4,000, or they'd start the process of taking the building, the diner, the last thing Ruth and I had built together, the only thing I had left of her. I didn't have $4,000. I didn't have 400. I sat in this very diner one November night after closing, with that notice on the counter in front of me, and I thought about how I was going to lose the last piece of my wife, and I am not ashamed to tell you it was the lowest I've ever been. I thought some dark thoughts that night, the kind a man doesn't say out loud. And then, 3 days later, somebody saved my life, and I never knew who. I came in to open up one gray morning, and there was an envelope that had been slid under the front door. No name on it. Inside was cash, old soft bills, a little over $4,000, the exact sum, counted out, and a note. The note was written in a careful, slanting hand, a woman's hand, I thought, on a torn half-sheet of paper, and I have it memorized because I've read it about 10,000 times since. It said, "For a good man on a hard road. This town needs your light, so don't let it go out. Somebody out here is still glad you're in it. You don't owe me a thing. Just keep the door open." It was the exact sum I owed the bank, down to the dollar, which meant whoever left it knew my trouble, knew the number, knew the diner, and wanted nothing. Not credit, not thanks, not even to be known. I paid the bank that same day. I kept the diner. I kept the last of Ruth. And slowly, because somebody I'd never met had reached into the dark and told me my light was worth keeping, I started to come back to life. I tried for years to find out who it was. I asked everyone. I watched the regulars for any sign. I kept that note in the register where I'd see it every single day, and every single day I wished I could find the person who wrote it and tell them what they'd done, that they hadn't just saved a building, they'd saved a man who was about to give up, but whoever it was had done their kindness in the dark and let it stay there, and after 3 years, I'd made my peace with never knowing. I'm telling you all this so you understand that when that nervous woman sat down in my booth and told me I could leave if I wanted, I was the last man in Tennessee who was going to get up and walk away from somebody who expected to be left. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Sit tight. You take cream?" She looked up at me, surprised, like that wasn't the answer she'd braced for. Yes, please. I poured us both coffee and I sat back down. And I got my first real look at her in the diner light. Her name was Tess Hadley. She was 36, Bonnie had told me, but she looked like life had charged her interest on every one of those years. She was thin in the way that comes from skipping meals so somebody else can eat. Her coat was good once but had been mended at the cuff. Her hands, wrapped around the coffee mug like she was grateful just for the warmth of it, were a working woman's hands. And her eyes had that particular flat carefulness I knew well, because I'd worn it myself for a while, the look of a person who has learned to expect the worst, so the worst can't surprise them anymore. "You don't have to do this," she said. "The coffee, the being polite. Bonnie means well, but she didn't tell you the whole story, did she? About me." "She told me your name and that you were nervous," I said. "That's about it, so why don't you tell me the rest yourself if you want to? And if you don't want to, we can just drink this coffee and talk about the weather, and you can be on your way. No harm either way." Tess Hadley looked at me for a long moment, like she was trying to find the trick in it. Then she wrapped both hands tighter around the mug and she told me. She'd had a husband, once. He'd left when their daughter was a baby, near 5 years back, just disappeared the way some men do, and she'd been raising the little girl alone ever since. Her name was Maddie, the daughter, 6 years old now. Tess had worked at the textile plant 2 towns over until it shut down 8 months ago and sent 400 people looking for work in a county that didn't have it. She'd been getting by on part-time shifts and pride and not much else, and she'd fallen behind on the rent. And the long and short of it was that at the end of the month she and Maddie were giving up the little house they rented and moving 300 miles to Kentucky to her aunt's place, because she had nowhere else to go and no way left to stay. "So, that's me," she said, with a small, tired, defiant lift of her chin that I'd come to know was the most stubborn and beautiful thing about her. A 36-year-old woman with a 6-year-old, no job, no husband, no house as of 3 weeks from now, on a blind date she only agreed to because your sister is kind and wouldn't take no. I'm leaving town. There's no point to any of this. So, really, Sam, you can leave if you want. I won't think less of you. I'm used to it." "You keep saying that," I said, "that you're used to people leaving, used to people taking one look and going." "Because they do," she said simply. No self-pity in it, just a fact she'd lived. A woman like me, with nothing and a kid and a hard-luck story, men buy the coffee and check their watch. I learned a long time ago to give them the door first before they take it. It hurts less if it's your idea. And something about the way she said it, the particular weary grace of it, snagged at me. I couldn't have told you why. It was like hearing a song you can't place, a few notes that you know from somewhere but can't name. I let it go. We kept talking. And here's the thing. It was the best evening I'd had in 3 years. Because once Tess Hadley decided I wasn't going to bolt, once she let that flat, careful look soften just a little. She turned out to be funny. Dry and quick and a little wicked, the way people get when they've survived enough that nothing much scares them anymore. She had opinions about everything. She told me my pie case was a disgrace and that the lemon meringue looked like it had given up on life, and she was right, and I laughed harder than I had since Ruth died. She talked about her daughter with a fierce, soft light in her eyes. She noticed things, the way Ruth used to notice things. Halfway through the evening, she looked around my diner, really looked at it, the way you look at a place that matters to you, and she said, "This is a good room, Sam. You can feel it. Some places just feel like somebody loved them. This is one of those." "My wife loved it," I said. "Ruth, she passed 3 years ago." Tessa's face went soft and sad. "I'm sorry," she said. 3 years ago?" And something flickered across her face just for a second, something I couldn't read, and then it was gone. We talked the way you can only talk to a stranger at midnight, when the regular rules are off and there's nobody left to perform for. She asked me about Ruth, really asked, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't said out loud to a living soul. How Ruth used to dance to the radio while she wiped down the counter at closing. How some mornings the diner still felt like it was holding its breath waiting for her. Tess didn't flinch from any of it the way people do, didn't change the subject or get that pinched, uncomfortable look folks get around a widower's grief. She just listened and nodded, and when I was done she said, "She sounds like she was the real thing. You can always tell by the room a person leaves behind. This one's still full of her." And I thought, this woman understands grief from the inside, and I caught myself wondering what hers had cost her. She told me some of it then. The husband who walked out and never sent a dime. The plant closing, 400 people and one stamped notice on a Friday afternoon. The particular cruel arithmetic of being poor, how a flat tire isn't an inconvenience when you're living that close to the edge. It's a catastrophe that takes 2 months to climb back from. She laid it all out plain, without once asking me to feel sorry for her, and somehow that was the very thing that made me feel for her the most. People who beg for your pity rarely get it. It's the ones who've stopped expecting it who break your heart. And the whole time that snag kept tugging at the back of my mind, that maddening sense that I knew her from somewhere. A few notes of a song I couldn't name. Twice I almost had it. Twice it slipped away. There was something about the way she looked at the diner, I decided, like she wasn't seeing it for the first time. But I told myself I was imagining things. A lonely man, reading meaning into a kind stranger, and I let it go, and we kept talking. We talked until past midnight. I refilled the coffee 3 times, and the whole evening that snag kept tugging at me, that sense of a thing I knew but couldn't see, and it was driving me a little crazy, until the moment near the end of the night when Tess asked for a pen. "Let me give you my number," she said. "Not because anything's going to come of it, I'm leaving in 3 weeks, but because you're the first man in a long time I've enjoyed talking to, and if you ever want to talk again before I go, I'd like that." She smiled, a real one, finally. "And somebody ought to talk you into fixing that pie case." I gave her a pen and an order ticket off the pad, and she bent over the counter and wrote out her name and her phone number in a careful, slanting hand. And the world stopped, because I knew that handwriting. I had been looking at that handwriting every single day for 3 years. The particular slant of it, the careful loops, the way the letters leaned into each other like they were holding each other up, it was the handwriting on the note in my register, the note that came with $4,000, the note that saved my life. I must have made some kind of sound, because Tess looked up alarmed. "Sam, are you all right? You've gone white." I couldn't speak for a second. I reached past her to the register and I took out the note, the soft, worn note I'd read 10,000 times, and I laid it on the counter next to the order ticket she'd just written. Same hand, beyond any doubt, the same hand. The careful, slant, the leaning letters. "For a good man on a hard road." And right beside it, Tess Hadley, and a phone number. Tess looked down at the 2 pieces of paper side by side, and I watched the color drain out of her face the way it must have drained out of mine. She knew she'd been caught. I saw her start to reach for a denial, saw her open her mouth to say it wasn't her, and then she looked up at my face and whatever she saw there stopped her. "It was you," I said. My voice came out rough. 3 years ago. The envelope. The $4,000. It was you." "Sam, don't," I said. "Please don't tell me it wasn't. I've looked at that handwriting every day for 3 years. I'd know it anywhere on God's earth. It was you." Tess Hadley sat down slowly on the counter stool, like her legs had gone out from under her, and she stared at that note she'd written 3 years ago, and the fight went out of her, and very quietly she said, "I never wanted you to know. That was the whole point. You weren't ever supposed to know." "Why?" I said. "Tess, why? You barely knew me. Did you even know me?" "A little," she said. "I used to come through Cooper's Mill on my way to a job I had. Back then, before everything. I'd stop here for breakfast sometimes. You and your wife." She smiled, a sad and faraway smile. "I came in once not long after my husband left me. Maddie was a tiny baby, and I was at the end of my rope, hadn't slept, didn't have it together, and I sat in that back booth and the baby was crying, and I was about to cry too, and I realized at the register I didn't even have enough to cover the breakfast I'd ordered. I was so ashamed I wanted to die. And your wife, Ruth, she just took one look at me and that baby, and she boxed up my food and pressed it into my hands and said the breakfast was on the house. And she said," Tessa's voice caught, "she said, 'Honey, everybody hits a hard road. Somebody fed me once when I couldn't pay. You'll do the same for somebody someday. That's how it works.' And she wouldn't take a dime. She sent me off with a full box and a kind word when I was at the bottom of my life. I had to sit down myself. Because that was Ruth. That was Ruth exactly, down to the words. Somebody fed me once when I couldn't pay. She used to say that. It was the whole philosophy of how she ran this place. I never forgot it," Tess said. "Your wife, the way she saw me when I was invisible, and then, a couple of years later, when I'd gotten back on my feet for a while, when I had a steady job and a little put by, I came through town again, and I stopped to come say hello to her, to thank her properly after all that time." She looked at me, and her eyes were wet now. And the man at the gas station told me she'd passed, and that her husband was about to lose the diner, that the bank was taking it. The whole town knew. They said you were drowning, Sam, that you'd lost your wife and now you were going to lose everything she built, and that it was the saddest thing. A good man going under like that. So you paid it off, I said. The whole thing. To the dollar. I had a little insurance money, she said, from my own troubles. It was most of what I had. But I thought— Her voice broke and she pressed her hand to her mouth for a second and then she went on. I thought, that woman fed me when I was invisible and told me I'd pass it on someday. And here was the someday. And here was her husband about to lose the one thing she loved. And I had just enough to keep her light from going out. How could I not? It wasn't even a question. It was just paying back what she gave me, to the only place left to pay it. You signed it. Somebody out here is still glad you're in it, I said. You let me think it was a stranger. You let me spend 3 years not knowing. Because it wasn't about you knowing, Tess said simply. It was about your wife's kindness coming back around the way she said it would. If you'd known it was me, you'd have tried to pay me back, and that would have ruined the whole thing. Ruth didn't feed me, so I'd owe her. She fed me so I'd pass it on. Passing it on doesn't work if you sign your name to it and collect the thanks. She wiped her eyes. I gave that money to honor a dead woman who was kind to me once. The last thing I wanted was credit for it. And I want you to understand what was happening to me in that moment, sitting in my own diner at 1 a.m. For 3 years, I had carried 2 separate griefs that I thought would never touch. One was losing Ruth. The other was never being able to thank the stranger who saved me. And in the space of about 10 minutes, those 2 griefs had reached across 3 years and become one single, unbearable, beautiful thing. Because the stranger who saved me wasn't a stranger at all. The stranger who saved me was Ruth's own kindness, sent back to me through a woman my wife had fed at the lowest moment of her life. Ruth had saved the diner. Ruth had saved me. She'd just done it from beyond the grave, through the hands of a tired, defiant, beautiful woman who never wanted a word of thanks. I couldn't speak for a long while. And then I told Tess Hadley the thing that made her cry. I'm not sure I said it well, but I said it true. For 3 years, I said, I've wanted to find the person who saved my life so I could tell them what they did. And I'd just about given up. I thought I'd go to my grave never getting to say it. And here you are, sitting in my diner, telling me you might as well leave because nobody ever stays. I had to stop and steady myself. Tess, you are not somebody I would ever leave. Do you understand me? You're not a hard luck story I'm going to check my watch and walk away from. You're the reason I'm still here. You're the reason this diner is still standing. You reached into the worst night of my life and you kept my light from going out, and you asked for nothing, and you've been carrying your own load all alone ever since, telling yourself, nobody stays. My own voice broke now. Well, I'm going to tell you what my wife told you. Somebody helped you once when you couldn't pay, and now it's my turn to do the same for you. That's how it works. You're not leaving here invisible, Tess Hadley, not while I'm alive to see you. And Tess Hadley put her face in her hands, those worn, careful hands, and she cried. Not pretty crying, the deep, shaking kind, the kind that comes from a place that's been locked up so long it's forgotten how to open. 3 years of carrying it alone. A whole life of giving the door first so it would hurt less. She cried like something was finally breaking loose, and I came around the counter and I sat next to her. And I didn't say anything else because some moments don't need words, they just need somebody to not leave. And I didn't leave. I sat right there with her until the crying eased, which is the only thing I had to give, and it turned out it was the thing she'd needed for 3 years and never once gotten. I thought, that night, that the worst of it was behind us, that she'd been seen, finally, and thanked, and that whatever was going to grow between us could start from there, on honest ground. I was wrong about that, and being wrong taught me something I should have already known about people like Tess Hadley, people the world has left enough times, because being seen is the most frightening thing in the world to someone who has spent their whole life making sure nobody ever looks too close. She didn't call the next day, or the day after. She'd written me her number, but the phone stayed quiet, and when I finally swallowed my pride and called hers, it rang through to a recording, and she didn't call back. And slowly, with a sinking feeling in my gut, I understood what was happening. I had done the one thing she'd spent 3 years making certain no one could do. I'd found her out. I'd taken her secret, the kindness she'd buried on purpose so it could never become a debt, and I'd dragged it into the light and laid it on the counter between us. And to a woman who'd survived her whole life by never letting anybody close enough to leave her, being known like that wasn't a relief. It was a danger. She had given me that money precisely so she would never, ever have to sit in front of me and be thanked. Never have to be that naked in front of another person. And now I knew everything. And the safest thing in all the world for Tess Hadley to do was exactly the thing she had always done. Run first. Give me the door before I could give it to her. Pack up early, drive to Kentucky, and never look back at the town where a man had seen all the way through her. I found out from Bonnie that she'd already started loading boxes. So I did something I'd done maybe twice in 15 years of business. I locked the front door in the middle of a Wednesday, turned the sign to closed, and I drove out to the little rented house at the edge of town where Tess and Maddie were living out their last days in Cooper's Mill. There was a small U-Haul trailer in the gravel drive, half loaded. The front door was open, and through it I could see Tess wrapping plates in newspaper, moving fast, the way you move when you're trying to outrun something. She looked up when my truck pulled in, and her face did a complicated thing, part gladness and part pure panic, and she came out onto the little porch and pulled the door half shut behind her so the child inside wouldn't hear. "Sam," she said, "you shouldn't have come out here. You stopped answering your phone. I've got a lot of packing." She wouldn't look at me. "We're leaving Saturday. It's better this way. Cleaner." Cleaner for who? For both of us. And there it was, the old flat carefulness sliding back over her face like a shutter coming down. "Look, Sam, you found out a thing about me. Fine. Now you feel like you owe me, and I don't want to be owed. I have never once in my life wanted to be owed, and the only thing worse than being a charity case is being somebody's debt they're trying to pay off. So let's just call it even. You don't owe me anything. I told you that 3 years ago in the note, and I'm telling you again now. Go home, run your diner, live your life. We'll be in Kentucky and you can forget the whole thing." "Is that what you think this is?" I said. "You think I shut the diner down in the middle of a workday and drove all the way out here because I feel like I owe you $4,000? Don't you?" "No," I said. "And I think you know better, and I think that's exactly what's scaring you." I took a step closer, but not too close, the way you approach somebody who's ready to bolt. "Tess, I've spent 3 years grieving my wife and 3 years feeling like a ghost in my own life. And the first night I felt like a living man again was the night you sat down in my booth and told me I could leave if I wanted. Before I knew one thing about any envelope. Before any of it." I sat there and laughed for the first time since I buried Ruth, and it wasn't because you'd saved my diner, because I didn't know yet that you had. It was just you. The whole rest of it, finding out it was you who saved the place, that just told me something my gut had already figured out across that table, which is that you are the rarest kind of person I have ever met, and I have met this whole town. Her eyes were wet now, and her jaw was set hard against it. "People always leave, Sam." "I know they have," I said. "I know every single one of them did, your husband and the world and everybody, and I know you've made it your whole way of getting through, handing folks the door first so the leaving's at least your idea. I'm not asking you to believe nobody leaves. I'm just asking you to stay long enough to find out that this time, one of them might not. That's all. Just long enough to find out." My own voice had gone rough. "You kept my light from going out when I was a stranger to you. Let me try to keep yours from going out now that you're not." And Tess Hadley stood on that little porch with a half-packed trailer behind her and a 6-year-old behind the door, and I watched the longest war I've ever seen play out behind her eyes. 3 years of fear against one small, terrifying flicker of hope. And the hope won, just barely, the way it has to win, 1 inch at a time. "I'm scared, Sam," she said, and it came out as barely more than a whisper, and I think it might have been the truest thing she'd said to anyone in years. "I know," I said. "Me too. Let's be scared at the diner. The coffee's better there." She let out a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and behind the door a small voice called out, "Mama, who's here?" And Tess looked back at the door, and then at me, and something in her finally let go. Now, I still didn't have a grand plan. What I had was a woman who'd agreed to be scared at the diner instead of 300 miles away, which felt, that afternoon, like just about the biggest thing I'd ever won. So I did the only thing I know how to do. I was plain about it. "I've got a proposition," I told her a few days later when she came back to the diner, shy and uncertain, like she half expected me to have changed my mind about all of it. "And it's a real one, not charity, because I think you've had about enough of people's charity, and so have I. This diner's too much for one man. It's been too much since Ruth died. I've been drowning in it slow for 3 years. I need a partner in here, somebody who notices things, somebody who can run a room and talk a man out of a bad mood and tell me the truth about my pie case. The pay's not much to start, but it's steady, and it comes with the apartment upstairs that's been empty since Ruth and I bought our house, which is plenty of room for you and Maddie. I took a breath. I'm not asking you for anything else. I'm not asking you to stay in Tennessee for me. I'm asking you to stay because this town needs your light too, same as it needed mine, and because I could use the help, and because 300 miles is too far to drive away from the only person who's made me laugh since my wife died. That's the whole offer. You don't owe me a thing. You never did. Tess Hadley looked at me across the counter for a long, long moment, and I watched the old reflex rise up in her, the one that wanted to give me the door before I could give it to her, and then I watched her decide, for once in her hard life, to believe that somebody might actually stay. "Maddie likes pie," she said finally, her voice thick. "If we stayed, she'd want to know there'd be pie." "Tell her," I said, "that the pie situation is about to improve dramatically because her mother is going to fix my disgraceful pie case." And Tess Hadley laughed, wet and broken and real, and she said, "All right, Sam, all right, we'll stay." She and Maddie moved into the apartment over the diner at the end of that month instead of driving to Kentucky. And I want to be honest with you about what this is and what it isn't, because I promised her honesty, and I'll give you the same. This is not a story about two people falling into a whirlwind romance. Tess had a lifetime of learning not to trust kindness, and I had 3 years of being a ghost, and neither of those things heals overnight. We went slow. We were partners first, in the diner, side by side, and we were friends before we were ever anything else, and for a good while that was exactly enough for both of us. But I'll tell you how I knew, the day I knew. It was a few months in, a slow Sunday afternoon, and I came out of the kitchen and I saw Tess behind the counter laughing at something a customer said, with Maddie doing her homework in the back booth. The same back booth where Ruth had once fed a desperate young mother for free. And the late light was coming through the windows the way it does, and the diner was warm and full and alive in a way it hadn't been in 3 years. And I stood there in the kitchen doorway, and I felt for the first time since Ruth died like the light was all the way back on. Not the same light. Ruth's light was Ruth's, and it's gone, and I'll grieve it the rest of my days. But a new light, a second one I never thought I'd get. Maddie took to me slow, the way a child does when she's learned that men leave. But she took to the diner fast, and she took to the pie faster, and somewhere in those first months she started calling me Sam in a way that sounded less like a stranger's name and more like family. One afternoon she fell asleep in the back booth over her crayons, and Tess and I stood there looking at her, and Tess said quietly, "Her father never once stayed. Not for her first step, not for her first word, not for any of it. And now she's got a whole diner full of people who'd notice if she was gone." She leaned her head against my shoulder the first time she'd done that. "You did that, Sam." "No," I said. "Ruth did that. 3 years ago with a box of free breakfast and a kind word. We're all just standing in the light she lit." Tess and I did marry, eventually, but not for a good while, and not because either of us needed rescuing, because by then neither of us did. We married because two people who'd each spent years alone had slowly, carefully, on purpose, decided to stop. It was a small wedding, in the diner, on a Sunday, with the regulars there, and Maddie holding the rings and Bonnie crying into her coffee, taking all the credit, which I let her have, because she'd earned it. We kept Ruth's photo on the wall behind the counter, where it had always been, and I'd like to think she was glad. I think Ruth, who believed with her whole heart that kindness comes back around, would have been the gladdest one in the room to see exactly how far around hers had come. That note still sits in the register. Tess says I should frame it, and someday I will, but for now I like seeing it there every morning when I open up, in her careful slanting hand. For a good man on a hard road, this town needs your light, so don't let it go out. I think about how close I came, that November night with the bank notice on the counter, to letting it go out for good. And I think about how a woman I'd never properly met, carrying her own baby through the worst stretch of her own life, remembered one act of kindness from my wife and paid it back to a stranger in the dark, asking nothing, and in doing so reached 3 years into the future and saved not just my diner, but the whole rest of my life. So that's my story. A wife who fed a hungry stranger and told her to pass it on. A stranger who passed it on in secret and never wanted the credit. A grieving man who got to spend 3 years being saved by kindness he couldn't see. and one tired, defiant woman who sat down in my diner certain that everybody leaves and got to find out, finally, that some people stay. Let me ask you something before you go. Tess spent her whole life giving people the door first, certain she'd be left. Have you ever found out years later who it was that quietly helped you when you were at your lowest, the person who never asked for thanks? Or have you ever been that person for somebody else? I read every comment, and I'd truly love to know. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because I've got more stories like this one coming. The next one's a good one. Trust me, it's a good one.